I'm sure this will be the last recording. Now we're on slide 42. So the Chinese response was sincere, but it was not very well planned or carried out. Part of the reason for this was corruption. A perennial Chinese problem, because of their mode of government, has been corruption. This is not something that only occurred during the decline of the Qing and so on. It has occurred during times of rising Chinese power and relative security as well. It's always been true, unfortunately, in the last perhaps 400 years, that Beijing or the central Chinese government has had limited control over its own officials. Its officials traditionally have been expected to administer within certain parameters their territory, not necessarily according to the law, but according to the expectations of the central government. And key among those expectations have always been to avoid local revolts. And as Chinese governments get weaker and weaker, there are more and more revolts, and these revolts typically are tied to corrupt behavior, increasingly corrupt behavior on the part of the officials who hold sway in these areas. Overtaxation, exploitation of the local people, especially the local women. These are very common themes of Chinese governance at the local level, unfortunately. So part of the reason for the failure of the self-strengthening movement, or the Yangwu Yundong, the Ziqiang Yundong, also known, was this corruption. The dynasty was increasingly losing control over its officials, who seemed themselves to realize that the days of the Qing were numbered. They would not follow national priorities or orders which might run against their business interests at the local level. Again, they taxed peasants unevenly and without mercy, often long periods in advance, and misused funds and allowed illegal activity, particularly theft of government resources. And when I say that, I'm talking about the government resources that were being marshaled in the interests of this self-strengthening movement that was intended to bring China and its capabilities further along in order to resist foreign power. The officials who were aligned with the reformers were sincere, but the bottom line was that they were unable to drive economic or industrial developments in the same way as were the Japanese. And that's why we spent some time in the last few slides looking at what the Japanese were up to, because the things that the Japanese did between 1868, the end of the old government, and the beginning of the Meiji Restoration, between 1868 and 1894, when they went to war against China, all those things the Japanese were able to do were things that the Chinese wanted to do, but that they failed to accomplish. Let's go on to slide 43. So the factors, to review them now, in Japan's victory and continued rise against China were that Japan was open to change, to foreign ways, to foreign practices, both in its government and in its military and in its administration of cities as well, besides the formation of two double dual cameral house, House of Lords and a House of Commons, the equivalent that the British had, was established in Japan, but also local governments that were directly accountable to the center were established in Japan. This is something that never happened in China. The samurai tradition had a great deal to do as well, although the samurai were considered to be a threat against the central government, and they and their privileges were gradually abolished. The point was that the Japanese had a warrior culture, as opposed to the Chinese, who did not think that soldiers were any good. There was a saying that good iron is not used to make nails, and good men are not used to make soldiers. And the Japanese were able to better apply military science, and especially the unity of command, organization, making sure, for example, before a military operation that there was a detailed operations order that everybody understood and that the officers would follow. The Japanese were good at that. The Chinese sucked at it. The integration of science and technology by the Japanese ended up giving them faster ships and more rapid-firing guns than the Chinese were able to marshal, and that's why the Chinese fleet was sunk during the Sino-Japanese War. As well, there was a very significant economic result from not only the Sino-Japanese War, but the Boxer War that followed in 1900, 1901, and that was the payment of indemnities as a result of the peace treaties that were negotiated that moved an enormous amount of money from China to Japan, and this enormous amount of money that I've listed at the bottom of this slide was used by the Japanese to further equip their navy, and that meant that they had a more effective and powerful navy to face the Russians a decade later. Let's go on to slide 44 for some quick images, self-images on the part of the Japanese, and the top slide here showing the surrender of Chinese generals in their roby sort of uniforms, as opposed to the Japanese with their beautiful Austrian-style military uniforms. The Japanese are a formal culture, and certainly they always exchange formal greetings in the form of a bow. Even today, but as you can see, the Chinese are on their knees, and the Japanese are not doing even so much as nodding their heads in return. This was meant to be an image to be consumed at home to show the Japanese population the benefits that all of their sacrifices had gained. However, this was sort of a self-image that was propagandistic in nature. You can see some Japanese officers here talking to none other than Jack London himself, not wearing such uniforms, not looking all clean and shiny. But you know how propaganda is. In any case, one of the mistakes made by the Chinese in that war, 1894-5, was that they did not have unity of command. Again, not only technology, but practices were a major problem for China. Their three major fleets were not under a unified command, and the Fuzhou fleet in the south refused to join the Northern Sea Fleet to confront the Japanese. Had they joined, and they did have ships that looked like modern warships. These were not Chinese junks, in essence, that were fighting the Japanese. These were steel-hulled ships with big guns that had been sold to China from Europe. But the problem was that they did not move as fast or fire as quickly as did the Japanese because they were older. versions of modern European naval vessels. Had the Fuzhou fleet joined, it would have doubled the amount of firepower and ships available, and it might have changed the picture, but that was another disadvantage faced by China. Let's go on to slide 45. Very briefly, because this is not a course about Russia or Korea or Japan, but I want to note that the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 5 resulted in, this was the final blow to China's influence in Korea. The Chinese had managed to keep some influence in Korea during the period after 1895, but when the Japanese went to war with the Russians, who had moved into Korea with some influence themselves in the intervening period, they were completely thrown out. And Korea was taken over by Japan. And this is a very key point, because you can see the position of Korea between China, Russia, and Japan. In modern times, and I'm speaking of the last 300 years, either Korea has been under the influence of one of these powers, or it has been split. When the powers in the region surrounding Korea are more or less equal, then the only way to have peace in this area, quite frankly, has shown to be to keep Korea divided. And this is why Korea is divided today, especially with the American influence weighing in. But during the height of the Qing dynasty, there was no challenging China on the part of Japan. The Japanese actually did invade Korea at one point, but it was during the Ming, and they lost, and they were thrown back to Japan eventually over the course of about a decade. This was at the beginning of the Tokugawa period in the 17th century. But after that, Korea stayed under the control of the Chinese because they could do it. They had the power to maintain control over this peninsula. And the problem in geopolitical terms is that if Korea is controlled by one of these powers, then the other power in the region must be on the decline, or not able to challenge that superior power. When things are more or less even, like they are today, then it's very difficult to maintain peace in the region without Korea being divided, with one half of it on the Chinese side and one half of it on somebody else's side. But let's go on to slide 46. The last desperate measures of the Qing dynasty included the so-called 100 days of reform, where the emperor, the young emperor who had just attained his majority, decided that he wanted to try to change the institutions, beginning with the old Confucian examination system that had kept China behind and had resulted in the failure of the self-strengthening movement. He lasted 100 days. And then, going on to slide 47, the Empress Cixi, who was the real power in the court and had been so for over 20 years, intervened. She arrested the Guangxu emperor and had him locked up for the rest of his life because she believed that he was going to mess everything up and expose China to foreign influence that would doom the country forever. Now, the Empress Cixi was a master politician for her time in the Chinese context, and if it hadn't been for all those pesky foreign powers, then she might have actually turned things around. She was a very smart individual, albeit not completely educated, but a very clever politician. However, she was uninterested in any sort of reform, and she was tone deaf to the power of the West, and probably unable to appreciate much of anything outside of the Chinese context. In other words, she was not a woman for her time. She was unqualified to have the sort of power that she did, and China suffered as a result. Let's go on to slide 48. It was during the height of her power that Chinese society really began to unravel. There was immense foreign influence. Foreign influence went crazy in China during this time. Confucian learning had declined. Chinese people, especially in the cities, who were seeking an education, were rejecting Confucian learning and seeking foreign learning. Although they really didn't know what they were seeking, they wanted to understand why the foreign powers were able to do so well against China. They wanted to understand technology. They wanted to understand systems of government. And this meant that China became very open to foreign influence, because there had been so much failure on the part of the Qing that people not only had open minds, they had a desperation for a different solution, which caused all sorts of experimentation, not only ultimately over the coming decades, not only with foreign forms of government and foreign ideologies, but also foreign cultural influences and religious influences. If you go on to our last slide here, you can see some of the numbers that show this. And I can only give you numbers from one sphere of human activity: the number of foreigners resident in China and the number of foreign companies doing business in China. You can see that in 1879 these numbers were small, but they grew like crazy in the first part of the 20th century and into 1921 and 1928, 1936 there, just before the Japanese invaded China proper, that foreign presence peaked. So in our next lecture, next week, we'll get into the Chinese Revolution that resulted, the fall of the Qing, the chaos that resulted with the warlord period, a completely independent Tibet and a more independent Xinjiang, the loss of Mongolia to the Russians, the advent of nationalism in China, which changed everything, and Japan's ascendance, which led to the awful and terrible invasion that cost the lives of millions and millions of people. Thank you very much.